So Buddhist teachings offer a really deep examination of what constitutes the very causes of suffering. And that's what we've been talking about, actually, so far this morning. Like this really close look. It's one of the major contributions of Buddhism is how closely it looks at the process, down to the subtlest level. And not only does it offer a deep examination and explanation of how it all works, it also gives lots of skillful means of how to work with all levels of when we're caught and hooked and like that. So that's really, really helpful. And it's said that if you were, again, to be studying the conceptual explanation, which can be helpful, more helpful for some people than others, but they say that because of the basic split, there are two levels of, and sometimes they're called veils, because they veil our basic wisdom, it covers it over. Sometimes they're called the two obscurations because they obscure the basic ground, and they're often compared to clouds covering the sun, and they're kind of ephemeral, but we take them very seriously. And those two levels, the two veils or the two obscurations, are, one is called the cognitive veil and one is called the klesha veil. And the cognitive veil is this basic duality, misperceiving reality. It's sometimes called the fundamental mistake, the original misreading or misperception of the illusion of separateness. That is considered the most basic cause of suffering, is just that illusion of separateness. And then this discussion we had is helpful because every time you polarize against yourself, for instance, I'm bad, for instance, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm damaged goods, I'm whatever, you're keeping that polarization in place. I don't know how else to say it. Like you're strengthening that illusion of separateness. Does that make sense? Just because it's based on dual way of looking at yourself. And then the next level is the klesha veil, which is the subject of our teachings. And that is that once you have that separation, the first veil it's called cognitive obscuration, means you're just not seeing right, you're not perceiving right. Then it gives birth to Shempa / klesha. Those are called the most basic causes of suffering. So when Buddha gave his first teachings, he worked primarily with the klesha veil in terms of what he talked about, the cause of suffering and cessation of suffering and so forth, and how to work with cooling down the kleshas. And this is where, in these foundation teachings of Buddhism, this is what I'm referring to as refraining, as like a code word or something, or like a motto or something. Please understand that in my talk today, it is very, very influenced and permeated by a Vajrayana Mahayana view of things. It's not, I don't really hold this foundation view which would have the kleshas as bad. And I've never been trained that way, and I see it as an obstacle, etc. But in the beginning teachings, it was all about this is such a generalization, but the basic view was that the kleshas are trouble and there's ways to cool them down. And the main method is refraining. So I prefer, even though refraining works well as a little, refraining, reframing, and relaxing, like something to hold on to, I prefer Punla Rinpoche's term of mindful gap. It's the same thing. But refraining does have a negative connotation to it, whereas mindful gap doesn't. So I prefer the term mindful gap. And what refraining is about is giving space so that you have some distance from the all worked upness, the churned upness, some insight, possibility for insight, possibility for working with it, cooling the heat down. The heat, you could say the basic energy of anger, say, and jealousy, but very intense. It's like the basic energy that causes volcanoes, and and the winds here. It's not like a little cozy wood stove fire or a gentle summer breeze. It's intense, and so it's natural that as the story of me, would be threatened by this. Like it's agitated. It takes some getting familiar with and comfortable with. So I wanted to read from Shantideva because I did this last year too, I think, because I love these verses. They're from the 5th chapter of the Way of the Bodhisattva, the Bodhicharyavatara. And he describes in this chapter, being on the verge of just creating a big mess. I wonder if his audience was laughing when he was saying this, because it's actually very funny. And it's funny the way cartoons are, because it's so accurate. And he describes Shempa, but Shempa just being like, you're just about to go off, and you're on the verge. There's an ember that's already kind of getting really hot, but there's no actual bonfire yet. So he says, when the urge, and urge is a great term, arises in the mind of feelings of desire, so that'd be like the craving, or wrathful hate, do not act, be silent, do not speak, and like a log of wood, be sure to stay. This is a repetitive thing that he keeps saying. And so for years, many Buddhist practitioners, particularly Vajrayana Mahayana practitioners, took this as repression. But this is a description of skillful means to cool down all that he's talking about here, so that you have a perspective and don't keep recreating the same cycle of pain. So then he says, when the mind is wild with mockery and filled with pride and haughty arrogance, and when you want to show the hidden faults of others, to bring up all dissensions and act deceitfully, and when you want to fish for praise, or criticize or spoil another's name, or use harsh language, sparring for a fight, it's then like a log of wood you should remain. And when you yearn for wealth, attention, fame, and a circle of admirers serving you, and when you look for honors, recognition, it's then that like a log you should remain. And when you want to do another down and cultivate advantage for yourself, and when you wish to gossip, when the wish to gossip comes to you, it's then that like a log you should remain. Impatience, indolence, faint-heartedness, and likewise haughty speech and insolence, attachment to your side, wanting things to go your way, when these arise, it's then that like a log you should remain. So his advice in the very first verse is Do not act, do not speak. So I give a little commentary on it in here, which I was reading. And I say that something along the lines of, there's various places where you can refrain, or there's various places where you could take a mindful gap. So the first is at what's called the ember stage, and someone was describing that they actually experienced that as very initial for and against. So you can catch it then, and if you do, that's the easiest place, because it's not, you're not that churned up yet. There's just as he uses the word, an urge or a pull, either I want it, or baby want, remember, or I don't want. You know, it's like it hasn't really worked itself up that much. No storyline. It's pre-verbal actually. Then, so should you miss that, the next place, which is a little more heat, the storyline has started. Now, once the storyline starts, it goes really fast, you know. And this process I'm describing goes really fast, but you can catch it at these different stages. The storyline has started. It's not pre-verbal anymore. There's a strong sense of polarization, dualistic view of yourself as bad or good or something, or other, and there's a storyline, but it's not that worked up yet. So at that point, you could take a mindful gap. You're starting to get enmeshed with the klesha, with the shenpa energy, like that's who you are. And then you take a mindful gap, and it's almost like your wisdom mind looking at your neurotic mind, or something like that. It's almost like there is something like some consciousness. You become conscious of being out of control, or just about on the verge of being out of control. So if you can catch the storyline when it isn't that strong yet, that's a very helpful place too. And the next place is that the storyline has already started and it's really going. And it might be that you don't even notice anything's happening until that. That's pretty common. You don't even notice it's happening until that. And then when it happens, you can interrupt it at that point. But you can see it's getting harder. But we're still talking about an internal process. So when the storyline is already going, there's quite a lot of heat, but you can still take a mindful gap and get some distance, some perspective. You give it space. That's the term that's usually used. You give it space. And then I think all of that precedes Shantideva's advice to do not act, do not speak. That's the hardest place to do it, because you're already so worked up. And the Shenpa is getting stronger, the klesha is getting stronger. If we use them as simultaneous, two words for the same thing. And it's definitely doable. And this is the standard, ordinary advice, leave the situation, go out and walk around the block, Standard information for partners, when they get really going. Just say, gonna just go take a mindful gap walk, and you walk around the block to sort of cool off. And equivalents of that. But as soon as you act, if that would be an aggressive act, or with addiction, it would be smoke it or drink it or whatever your addiction is to. Get the computer out and start, going with the 14 hours later, you get off. And whatever it is, whatever jealousy or whatever it is, you don't act and speak out of it. It gives you the chance to stay present with the energy. and go back to its basically good, dynamic, fluid quality. It gives you a chance. It allows the space to remember to be embodied, to remember to feeling what you're feeling. I mean, it just gives you the space for it to become workable. That's a word Trungpa Rinpoche used to use, workable. So mindful gap allows the space to become conscious and present. And do whatever you do to cool things down. In other words, your natural intelligence never went anywhere. It just gets obscured by the storylines and the strong sense of separation and story of me. It gets obscured, it's like you can't see it. If you're reading the Paul Etman Dalai Lama book, he talks about the refractory period. And what the refractory period is his observation as a scientist that when the Shenpa is really strong and going, that everything you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, everything, think for sure, is filtered through that Shenpa, filtered through that klesha. You just cannot perceive correctly when you're in the grips of it. With a mindful gap, it's like the clouds part and you're still vibrating, but you are conscious of vibrating. The storyline is still wanting desperately and keeps coming back, but you're aware of the obsessiveness of it, and you begin to get some perspective on the whole thing. So mindful gap is so important. This refraining, which I prefer the term mindful gap, is so important. And I contend that actually you can't do anything. None of the further things of refraining or relaxing can happen if you can't do that. So I have total respect for this mindful gap, this refraining, as absolutely crucial to being conscious, present, awake, embodied, being here.